to the District of Sports podcast, our sports podcast here at the Washington Times. I'm George Gerbo. A reminder to find us on all of your favorite podcast platforms, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, everyone under the sun. If you've got it, they've got us. Search Washington Times, and also visit washingtontimes.com/sports to find all of our sports reporting. And that includes from my esteemed colleagues, Matt Paris, back with us, busy analyzing the Commanders draft, which we'll do here in a few moments. Matt, welcome back.
Yeah, how's it going?
Doing well. And Jacob Calvin Meyer, who's got us covered on the Nationals and, more importantly, the Washington Capitals, who gear up here for the playoffs. Jacob, welcome inside.
Howdy. How you guys doing?
Doing good. We've got a lot to talk about here as we inch closer into playoff season for the Washington Capitals. That's where we'll start this district of sports with the Caps, who have had the roller coaster of a season. They started out the best team in the Eastern Conference, best team in their division, the Metropolitan. Carolina surged. They've now won that division, have the Hurricanes. Washington here, they're not playing their best hockey. Peter Laviolette called their effort in a 4-1 loss to the Islanders, where they gave up 4 unanswered goals. He called it lousy and said that they can't play like that going into the playoffs. And yet here we are with 2 games left playing like that going into the playoffs. But it's a team that's been banged up a little bit. And I guess that's the biggest place that we'll start, Jacob, is with the status of Alexander Ovechkin, who went into the boards Sunday against Toronto, injured, kind of shoulder first, hockey, the ambiguous term, upper body injury, but it looks like he's injured his shoulder. He was present in full uniform with the Caps on picture day out at Arlington at the training complex. Any status of how he is doing and if they'll get him back? 50 goals and 40 assists this season. He's had another career year this late in his career and is a key part of what Washington can do in the playoffs if he's healthy.
Right. Yeah. It was obviously a scary moment there for everybody involved. Nobody wants to see him go down, especially the team or its fans. But I think it's still up in the air. I think a lot of people are probably a little bit optimistic, knowing how tough Ovechkin is, knowing that if there is a playoff situation and if he thinks there's any chance he can go, that he probably will. Peter Laviolette said he was hoping that Ovechkin will be available for game 1, but he obviously did not play in Tuesday's game. And so it's kind of up in the air, and it's not a great position for the team to be, and it's not the time that you would want to see him go down. But at the same time, it could have been a lot worse. It did look like a little bit of a nasty crash into the boards there. So I think the fact that it's day to day and that it doesn't seem to be anything major, and that the people there in attendance for the team photo could see him walking around, and obviously it's a upper body injury, so you're not going to really be able to see anything. But the fact that he looked somewhat okay the other day was a good sign. And so I think this is just a wait and see, and it would obviously very much hamper their chances in the first round if he's not available to go in every game.
Laviolette saying to 106.7 The Fan that Ovechkin would not have played in that game against the Islanders if it was a playoff game. But as you mentioned, Jacob, he's missed, I believe it's a little less than 50 games in the regular season. His entire career, he's never missed a playoff game in his NHL career. And you figure he'll try his damnedest to make to get right and be ready for the first round, which starts next week. Speaking of the first round and other concerns that the Capitals might have going into it, we'll get into where they could slot here. Whether it be against one of 2 opponents, the Florida Panthers, who have been the best team in the NHL statistically. They're the points leader just by a hair over Colorado and still in line right now to win the President's Trophy as the best points team in the regular season. Or division opponent, the New York Rangers. They're 1-1 against. They will bookend their season, Matt, with opening against the Rangers, and they will close it against the Rangers at Madison Square Garden here at the end of this week. Your biggest concern for Washington as they turn this page here and move into next week into the Stanley Cup playoffs in the first round?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and you look at the Capitals goaltender situation, it's really just very much up in the air. Laviolette's kind of given Ilya Samsonov lately the chance to kind of seize this number one goaltending job, but he really hasn't. And so, whether they go with Samsonov or Vanacek, I think it's really could be a game by game scenario, and that's not ideal going into the playoffs. But I think if you're the Capitals, you just have to look at kind of the standings, and we can talk about who they'll play. But right now, they've played the Florida Panthers, and they're the best offense in the NFL right now, or the NHL, excuse me, in the NHL right now. And hell, they probably have a better offense than the Carolina Panthers do in the NFL. It would be a bad matchup for them, I think, and that's what's currently scheduled. So they have an opportunity to face the Rangers in the playoffs, but they're going to have to win their last two games to do it, it looks like. And so, I think these last two are must wins for them.
Yeah, Samsonov plays yesterday and goes back to play a puck and then gives up a shorthanded goal by mishandling the puck. Contrast that with Sunday's game where I believe Vitek Vanacek played in that 7-round shootout loss to Toronto where they lose Ovechkin and Vanacek gave up some goals there. It's still, I mean, you bring up the NFL, Matt, and you mentioned, if you have two quarterbacks, you have no quarterback, but in hockey, you can have two goalies sometimes. We've seen teams, Pittsburgh did it with Marc-Andre Fleury and Matt Murray to a couple of Stanley Cups, though different situations there. But if you are Peter Laviolette, Jacob, you were hoping to see this kind of coalesce into a 1A, 1B type of thing, or to see Samsonov, who seems to have been given the lion's share of the chances here to assert himself as the number one goalie and not have it happen yet. That's a concern. I think them just get, in an absence of Alex Ovechkin, just getting more shots on the net and scoring more goals. They've lost 3 of their last 4 games. They've been outscored 14-7 in those games. 2 of them have been losses in a shootout or an overtime, but you've like to see this team put more pucks on the net, and if you've got some goaltending issues, at least maybe you can compensate for that with increased offense, Jacob.
Right, yeah, and before this recent stretch of 3 losses in the last 4, they had won 6 of their last 7, so it's kind of been a little bit up and down, and even lately here to get those single point overtime losses could end up being huge for them if they do end up winning these last 2 games, or if however it plays out, if they can pass the Penguins, in the standings. But as it pertains to the goaltending situation, like you guys have said, they have given Samsonov every opportunity to kind of take the reins, and for a multitude of reasons, it just hasn't happened. And both of those guys are younger goaltenders, and frankly, that's just the situation that they're going to be in for the playoffs. So if there is going to be any sort of run out of the Capitals here in the Stanley Cup playoffs, it's going to have to be predicated on the team, the offense really, taking control and playing outstanding hockey, because I don't think anybody's going to expect consistent, performances in multiple rounds of the playoffs from a single goaltender on the team. And so it's going to have to kind of be carried by the goal scorers.
I'll ask both of you, how you see who they match up better against here. They do have 2 games left as opposed to the 1 game left. Jacob mentions Pittsburgh is the team that they are chasing, only a point behind the Pens, 100-101. Pittsburgh, 1 final game against Columbus on Friday. We'll definitely know Friday, the final day of the regular season. Washington has the back-to-back, and it's the, if you can say this, the easiest back-to-back in the NHL. You'll play on Long Island on Thursday, and then you go right across over to Manhattan on Friday and play the Rangers, so they don't have to go too far for their final 2 games, both against the New York teams. As Matt mentioned, the season series 1-1-1 this season against Florida, 1-1 against the Rangers. Is there something to be said for dropping down? And as good as Florida has been, it's a less hostile atmosphere than playing at Madison Square Garden. The Caps would be on the road regardless of who they play as either the second wild card team or the 3 seed. And is it advantageous to maybe get a team that hasn't seen you as much over on the other side of the conference and play in the Atlantic, even though Florida has been far and away. They've got, I'd be more concerned about getting pucks past Shesterkin, New York's goaltender, as opposed to Sergei Bobrovsky and Spencer Knight for Florida, who they're about a 90% save percentage, which for a team with Florida, as many wins, as many points they've had, you'd like to see that a little bit higher in the 92 to 94 save percentage range. So I think there's some cracks there in Florida's back end and in goaltending. But for the Capitals, Matt, is there a better matchup that you see here, whether it be New York or whether it be Florida?
Yeah, I think I'd still go with New York just because of I think Florida's offense with the Capitals' uncertain goaltender situation. And, New York has been a bit of a young team. They're a little bit unproven. And Florida doesn't have like a great track record the past few years. But just, if you look at Florida's and Washington's matchups, they took place early in the season. And I think the Panthers have become a very different team since then. I mean, this is they had a different coach to start the year who was fired for, a whole bunch of different reasons, not necessarily to do with their record. So, I just think that the Panthers, even though they've had a little bit of a lull going into these playoffs, I think they're still the team to be in the East.
Yeah, and it's Joel Quenneville losing his job after all the issues that went on in Chicago related to abuse in the locker room. And for Florida to be able to overcome that, it happened within the first 2 weeks of the season, and to have put up, career years from Jonathan Huberdeau, to be where they're at and be the best. They were really, really good last year. And because of the weird format last year, they draw Tampa in the first round and eventually lose to Tampa, and Tampa goes back out and wins the Stanley Cup. This year, they have proven themselves through the long run after that, the beginning of the season, to be one of the best teams in the NHL. Same question to you, Jacob. It's a little bit, Matt mentions the youth, which is definitely more on New York side, that you may be able to take advantage of them. They're less proven in that. Shesterkin, 935 save percentage. He's been absolutely incredible for them this season, but they are young at a lot of key positions. Lends itself to speed, but maybe Washington's experience with Ovechkin and Johansson and Kuznetsov is a better matchup there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you laid out some of the potential arguments of maybe why you would think, playing Florida would be a better matchup for the Caps. But, I think at the end of the day, that those arguments are sometimes can end up being overthinking the point a little bit. Mm-hmm. If the Rangers were, if it was a much better matchup for the Caps to play the Panthers, then they wouldn't be as good as they are. Like, at the end of the day, this is an amazing team. And so I don't completely throw out those arguments. And I think, the simplest answer here is that it probably doesn't really matter. If the Caps play well enough in the first round to beat Florida, they would probably also beat the Rangers, and maybe vice versa. And so I think you could probably argue that, either one, but my guess is that, Peter Laviolette and the rest of the team, they're not really, I don't think that they particularly care, aside from the fact that they probably do want to win these last two games. They probably do want to go into the playoffs on a high note and all of those things. But I don't think if they end up having to go down to Florida that they're going to, say that they have a significantly worse chance than if they were to have to go up to New York.
Former Caps coach Barry Trotz, after the win yesterday, gets another chance to potentially play spoiler in terms of playoff seeding, as the Islanders are far out of the playoffs, and maybe stunt Washington's chances and send them to play Florida. But with the Caps simply only needing 1 point to get by Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh only has one more opportunity to rack up points. It's Washington's choosing their own destiny there and how they want to finish the season and where they will end up seed wise as the NHL playoffs, the Stanley Cup playoffs, start next week. That leads us to the Washington Commanders, who open the 2022 NFL Draft in Vegas this Thursday with the 11th pick overall. 6 total picks as of right now, Matt. but only 3 of those are in the first 5 rounds of the draft. Does that lend itself to some movement to perhaps get at the high end of this draft, a draft that's, as it's been talked about and broken down here ad nauseum over the last month, doesn't really have the major consensus picks in places. So it's going to come down to a lot of, as opposed to maybe taking the best player on your board, like where is our best focus of need, which we'll get into for Washington here in a moment. But do you see the Commanders with only 6 picks and most of them being on the back end, lending them to moving around and maybe pulling in some more picks from other places?
I do. I think Martin Mayhew said the other day, the general manager, that he predicts some movement for some of their picks. Now, I'd be surprised if they traded out of 11, only because of more so the circumstances of this draft. It's not really a draft that teams are clamoring to move up for. There's no surefire quarterbacks that teams are itching to get. And so Washington is kind of in a tricky spot where I don't think they're going to have a lot of teams eager to jump into their spots. So, they could potentially move back in the first round, but I kind of would be surprised if that happens. So if they are looking at moving back, I think the 47th pick that they have in the second round would be a more logical spot to try and net a third round pick that they traded away for Carson Wentz. And so, it would just be, they would like some more assets because they've had a really quiet free agency and they still have a lot of needs on the roster, but it's kind of the situation that they find themselves in.
Biggest needs, Jacob, and I'll ask Matt the same question in a second, seems to point to 2 areas of focus, both in the secondary and at wide receiver, as you try and still figure out Terry McLaurin's contract situation. They would behoove them to bring in a playmaker, and Ron Rivera said that much this week, that they want to put a dynamic playmaker around Carson Wentz. And Rivera admitted that, you had a strategy up until a certain point about how you were going to address different needs after last season. And then in trading for Wentz and, of course, giving up some draft picks in the Wentz trade, that changes your scenario that now, okay, we need to focus on complementing what we have at quarterback. And it seems that wide receiver is the most likely place that Washington would go in that circumstance.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking at the team to potentially take a wide out at 11. I think it makes sense in a lot of cases, but so does taking somebody for the secondary. And so I think there's a lot of factors here that you listed that make it kind of intriguing, interesting, difficult for the team to decide what to do. And one of those is Terry McLaurin and his contract situation moving forward. It's pure conjecture on my part to even speculate, but if they're super confident that they're going to be able to sign McLaurin long term, then does that make it less likely that they take a wide receiver at 11, or vice versa? If negotiations aren't going well, or if they don't think they can get a long term deal done, does that make it more likely that they take a wide out at 11? I think there's a lot of complicating factors there. But when you bring in a quarterback like Wentz and you put the trust, the faith, the money into him, despite the fact that it's really a 1-year thing here to decide if he's going to be the quarterback here moving forward. But when you do that, I think surrounding him with some weapons is fair isn't the right word, but that's the most logical way to go about it. Is taking a rookie wide receiver in the first round the best way to do that instead of signing somebody? Maybe, but as we all saw this offseason, the price for wide receivers in free agency is outrageous. And so once they saw that and saw the prices that these guys were going for, some wideouts like Christian Kirk to the Jaguars, who is by no means a star wide receiver, getting a lot of money, that makes it so that maybe when they saw that, they said, maybe taking a wide receiver at number 11, it makes the most sense.
Matt, I'll leave it to you to name some of those players. The guys that I've seen Drake London's name from Southern Cal, 6'4", wide receiver being mentioned. Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson from Ohio State are another 2 other guys that could definitely shine. And we know that it's kind of like a tangential relationship between Buckeyes players and the Washington Commanders in terms of guys that either come from here and end up at Ohio State and then make their way back to Washington, or guys that Washington ends up drafting. Of course, Chase Young is the most prominent example. Guy that's further down on draft boards, and this is a little bit of selfish talk because I saw both of them play in person, playing in the Big Ten against Maryland. I really like what Jahan Dotson does. 1,182 yards last year and 12 touchdowns on an offense that was not nearly as explosive and dynamic as Ohio State's offense, where Olave had Garrett Wilson next to him, and he had C.J. Stroud throwing to him. Dotson did not have those benefits in Happy Valley and still managed to put up those kind of numbers. He's slotted more down in the 20s, so it's probably a reach for Washington at 11. But the names you're hearing for guys that Washington could take there, whether it's on offense or on in the secondary.
Yeah, I think it kind of just depends on, if there's a receiver running the top 10, how does that order go? I think Garrett Wilson, if he's there, which I really doubt he'll be, would be kind of a home run.
Mm-hmm.
Drake London would give Washington something that they don't have, which is size. Cam Sims is really only the receiver above 6 feet. I guess they have Antonio Gandy Golden too, but he's really not much of a factor. And London from USC has the ability to make contested catches. He has a nice quick step. He'd really give that group something interesting. Chris Olave is a guy that they really like. Ron Rivera was seen talking to him at Ohio State's Pro Day. They're obviously well-versed with having Ohio State receivers with Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel. So they know that school produces pretty big-time receivers. And so outside of that, Kyle Hamilton is a guy from Notre Dame, safety. If I had to guess, I bet that would be the pick. They have a need at this Buffalo nickel position that they run in kind of a package. They use him as a bigger nickel cornerback, and that's what Landon Collins was last year. And he's not just your traditional safety. So I think they would love to have Kyle Hamilton there. If you want to go cornerbacks, Derek Stingley from LSU would make a lot of sense, but I think Hamilton or receiver would probably be the way that they're leaning right now.
I'll ask you one final question, Matt. In this franchise that, at least in the 10 years since I've lived in the Washington area, I'm not surprised by anything they do anymore. Anywhere up and down those picks, whether they add to them or they don't, will they take a quarterback? And I mentioned the historic, quasi-recent, I guess 10 years now, historical precedent of them, trading all those picks, 3 number ones for RG3, or to get to St. Louis to get the number 2 pick and take RG3. And then 3 rounds later in the same draft, also taking Kirk Cousins. One is no longer in the league in Robert, and Kirk Cousins, of course, is now on to Minnesota. Is there a chance somewhere in there that they're still sniffing or looking around for a quarterback in this draft?
I think so. I mean, yeah, they only have 2 quarterbacks on the roster right now with Wentz and Taylor Heineke. And Ron Rivera has talked about they will add a third arm at some point. They do have 2 7th-round picks, so that's a chance for them to draft a developmental guy. Mm-hmm. Maybe they take one even. I still would be surprised if it was even the 2nd round, but maybe if they do net a third in there somewhere that they could use a pick for that. But I do think they're looking more at the developmental types, just to have another arm in camp. And, we've certainly seen the past few years that having one quarterback just isn't good enough for Washington, because they've really cycled through them all since really 2019 or 2018 when Alex Smith got hurt.
Yeah, this always seems to be some sort of, need at the quarterback position. They filled it at the starting spot with Carson Wentz now, but God forbid something happens like you had literally in the first game last year against the Chargers with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and then suddenly you're down to just 2 with Heineke. That now it's time for them to shore that up and maybe just have a nice solid quarterback room going into training camp, and hopefully it can be something they don't have to worry about as much, at least in this 2022 season for the Commanders. Let's wrap up with the Washington Nationals, who expectedly, we can say in some form, have struggled to get out of the gates here in the first couple of weeks of the baseball season. They are 6-13, the second worst record in the National League. Jacob, they've lost 6 straight games, including 8 of their last 10. A couple of different factors, and like the one that sticks out to me and that we're seeing a lot of people use across baseball is how much this stunted spring training is causing guys not to be ready or not to be up to their full 100% speed or preparation where they'd like to be going into this season. Is that any of a factor for Washington? And of course, injuries have hit Washington a little bit. D. Gordon is on the injured list. Josh Bell is still playing, even though he's had a banged up knee. D. Strange Gordon. Can you chalk it up to any of those specific issues about spring training or guys being injured early, or is this still charting along the path that we've seen it go? There in the bottom third, pretty much in all major offensive categories: 21st in batting average, 20th in total runs, 28th in slugging percentage this season are the Nationals.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of things, but I think the easiest explanation is that, even if this team was completely healthy, it's still not good enough to compete. And I don't think that surprises anybody. Everybody knew coming into the season what it was going to look like. I think it's gotten a little ugly sooner than people would have liked. I think the most surprising part of the season certainly has been that the offense has been, the bats have been very cold. I mean, they even after the trade deadline last year, when they jettisoned off, almost every top player on their team except for Juan Soto, still the offense the second half of the year was one of the best in the big leagues. And, through the first, however many games of the season, 19 games of the season, they have one of the worst offenses in all of baseball. They've scored 4 or fewer runs in 16 of 19 games. And even recently, it's been worse, scoring 1 or 2 runs almost every game in the last week. And so, obviously, the starting pitching has been abysmal. And when you combine the fact that you're not scoring enough runs and your starting pitchers aren't going deep into games, and then your bullpen's throwing too many innings, it's kind of just a recipe for disaster. Now, with all that said, you can't ignore the injuries aspect of this, specifically when you have Steven Strasburg, who has barely pitched the last 2 seasons, who's still rehabbing from his thoracic outlet syndrome surgery, and Joe Ross as well, and even Anibal Sanchez, who I don't think anybody was super excited about, but still a veteran arm who you can maybe trust to go 4 or 5 innings and to get the job done every 5th day. He's a guy who was supposed to be in the rotation, and then once he got back to DC, something flared up, and so now he's on the injured list as well. And even the bullpen has been a positive for the team, generally speaking. Even though the overall stats don't look great because they've had a few really, really bad innings, like on Sunday with a 6-run ninth. Between a few different guys like Tanner Rainey and a few others, they've had a solid bullpen. But even there, with Sean Doolittle, who was great in his first 6 outings, then he got hurt, and Mason Thompson in the first series of the season, he got hurt, and Will Harris, who also similar to Strasburg is recovering from that same surgery, he's still rehabbing, and he hasn't even resumed throwing yet. And so the combination of the team expectedly, being in a rebuild, the bats being cold, and the injuries, it has not been a pretty start.
We'll finish with the bright spot, at least, what's a point of progress you can point to on this team if you're a Nationals fan, at least something to look forward to. The bats are cold. You need them to come around. Starting pitchers, you need to perform. Patrick Corbin's had some, rough outings, but if there's a place to point to with at least, okay, this is something we can work with going forward, it is that bullpen, as you mentioned before the Sunday game against the Giants, 0.94 ERA, and opposing batters only hitting 190. You mentioned Tanner Rainey in his 5 appearances, 3 saves. And I'll make the stupid joke that he leads the league in ERA for a closer with 0. So that's better than other. Manuel Clase gave up for Cleveland, gave up a lot of runs. He's got the same amount of saves, but has a much wilder ERA. So to be able to do that, especially when you're not getting the offense, to have a closer come in situations that are going to be tight, to be able to hold that down without spraying a couple of hits here and there and barely getting out of it, to be as dominant as Rainey has in these early parts of the season is something to highlight and look forward to if you're a Nationals fan.
Right. Yeah. It obviously hasn't been a great start to the season, but there are some positives, and the bullpen is one of them. And it's not just Rainey. Even Victor Arano has been probably their best reliever. He's thrown 9 innings and he has 14 strikeouts, and I don't think he's walked a batter yet. And so for him turning into, so far, being a dominant reliever is certainly, a welcome development for the team. And, there's a few other positives as well. Josiah Gray's been great. I think he's got something like 28 or 30 strikeouts in 20 innings, and he's been solid out of the rotation. And, not fantastic, but for a 24-year-old who's, gearing up for his first full season as a major league starter, he's certainly been a positive, probably the only positive in the rotation, since you noted a few other guys like Patrick Corbin who just are not getting the job done. And then for the fans who are focused on the minor league players, some of the prospects coming up through the system, if for the fans inclined to look towards the future, there's a few guys down there who are killing it. Luis Garcia and Brady House. I believe they tied last night, but I think House took over. I think House leads minor league baseball in hits, and I think Garcia might be second. And so, Garcia is a guy that they're trying to, in AAA, that they're trying to get him to really learn how to be an everyday shortstop. He was up the last 2 seasons for parts and playing a lot of second base, but he's 21 years old, and there might be some service time manipulation there as well. But he's with how much Alcides Escobar is struggling with the bat, which is not a surprise for anybody who knows anything about Alcides Escobar's career. Luis Garcia is a guy who will probably be up after May 25th, and is a guy that we'll get to see play shortstop every day, and there's going to be some bumps and bruises there, probably specifically defensively, but there are a few guys in the minors who are playing very well that can get fans at least excited for the future.
Washington with the second worst ERA among a pitching staff in baseball, 5.34, and they are the second worst in terms of batting, teams batting against 275. But as you mentioned in your story about the bullpen, Jacob, those bullpen arms have thrown the most innings of any in Major League Baseball. So to have those starters at least take some of the pressure off of the bullpen, even if you're not scoring runs, if you can get through a couple of the first 3 to 5 innings without giving up 7 runs on a given day, that might put you in a better position going forward as the season goes.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time, frankly. If you ask your bullpen to throw as many innings as the Nationals have asked their bullpen, then you're going to have innings like the ninth on Sunday. It's just, basically, unless you're the Tampa Bay Rays, who seemingly find who find these excellent relievers out of nowhere, and they might be growing them somewhere nearby. I don't know how they get these guys, but basically, aside from them and maybe the Astros, there's no team, and the Astros don't even have to rely on their bullpen, and they don't ask as much as the Rays. But this isn't by design, right? Like the Rays, that's how their team is built.
Yes.
They do the opener. They don't expect their starters to go third time through. That's not how the Nationals are built. It's not how most major league teams are built. I understand early in the season, because especially the first 2 weeks when starting pitchers weren't going more than 90 pitches because of the shortened spring training, it was expected for relievers to be throwing more. That's why roster sizes were bigger. That's why you see a guy like Tanner Rainey, who's the team's best reliever, and he's only thrown a handful of innings, is because of how large the roster sizes are now. But nevertheless, the fact that the starting pitchers are very rarely going into the 6th inning, and even the thought of going into the 7th seems outrageous at this point. It's putting a lot of pressure on the bullpen, and for the most part, the bullpen has stepped up and done a good enough job considering the pressure that they've been put under.
If you see Tanner Rainey come out there as the scheduled starter for one of these games, then you'll know something truly radical has happened. But that's probably not going to be the case for Davey Martinez here in the short term. That will put a wrap on this district of sports. Matt will have all of our draft coverage as the Commanders enter into the now 3-day event that the NFL puts on, coming to you from the fountains at the Bellagio in Las Vegas, among other locations. Matt, tell them where they can find your work and follow along with the Commanders picks.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Matthew_Paris, Paras, and you can read all my work on the Washington Times website, washingtontimes.com/sports. And I'll be in Ashburn the next 3 days covering the draft, so I'm looking forward to that.
And Jacob, as the Caps head into the playoffs here, and Washington and the Nationals continue their season, and we get ready for hopefully an extended season of playoff hockey in the district, where they can find your reporting.
Same website as Matt, and on Twitter at Jacob Calvin Meyer, and I'm excited to see what happens in the draft. It's going to be a fun time coming up with Capitals in the playoffs, and because once they're bounced, it's going to be a long summer with the Nationals.
It's the spring. Washington spring is really it's one of the only places in the country you can say really celebrates spring. Of course, with the cherry blossoms and everything. The Caps have been a big part of that for the last 2 decades, basically, and the Nationals have done their part over the last couple of seasons. But this kind of feels like those early Nats years, in the time just after the RFK years, but before the glow up with Bryce Harper, we'll call it. In those years, initially moving at their 15 years at Nationals Park now. And it kind of, at least right now, feels like those early seasons, which means good tickets available if you like having a nice summer evening. They got a lot of stuff down there at the ballpark and places to stand and everything. It's a fun time, but the product on the field might not be as good as the recent seasons with the World Series championship, of course. Also, a reminder to find the District of Sports on all of your favorite podcast platforms. Just search Washington Times there. You can find me at Gerbo3, and you can find all of our sports writing at WashingtonTimes.com/sports and at WashTimeSports on Twitter. For Matt and Jacob, I'm George. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.